Guys. All right, we are talking about finances, and this is our last seminar, the inheritance webinar. And I got to be honest with you, I really didn't think life would be this hard. That's where we're going to start today. So I flipped the switch again. This was years ago. I flipped the switch on the panel, and the electricity just would not come on. Nothing. The entire medical clinic had 0% power. Okay. And the thing that was frustrating about this is I thought I was getting to a better place in life, right? I had finished my training somehow in spite of a brain injury, and I had almost finished paying off my medical bills and gotten a job as a doctor. And so things were heading in the right direction, and I thought getting better. But then one day I sat with patients scheduled and no electricity and threats about not getting a paycheck. And I just thought, gosh, God, I didn't think life was supposed to be this hard, right? Like, was this supposed to be like the promised land that I had been fighting for all these years? Like, I went through residency and all the rough stuff, and this is as good as it gets? Is that what was happening? I started to really wonder and really question, what is God's best for me? And so we've been talking about Deuteronomy 8 and really how it goes through. It talks with the Israelites right before they're about to go into the promised land. And God is going through all of the things that they need to remember as they go into their destiny. And we want to think about it in rethinking our finances the way that God thinks about them. And so we've learned already that God tells them to look to the past, to get a vision for the future, and then to kind of live out obedience and trust, and they will see great things come to fruition. And another way to think about these lessons is I think about them as God giving us authority. I think of this whole story of them going into the promised land as God giving the Israelites authority and helping them realize the authority that they have here on earth. So the reason I say that is because really we get authority in multiple ways in our lives. So you can get authority straight from God. That's the first way the Bible talks about getting authority and being given something worthwhile. Genesis clearly tells us that humans have special authority. So God literally calls us to manage and take care of the world. From the very beginning, we're given dominion over the animals, over the plants, and are supposed to take care of the world that God created. We have basically become substitutes for Him in managing this world. And then the Bible kind of clearly talks about authority in a different way and being trained to get authority. And I think Moses' story is a really great example of this, right? Like Moses is born as a regular person, but then he's actually trained in royalty. He actually literally ends up the son of the princess, and is trained in a different way of thinking and a different way of behaving, not just as a slave, but as royalty. He thinks, he behaves, he delegates like someone with authority. So God actually teaches the rest of the Israelites how to kind of think like this, not to think of themselves as slaves, but to think of themselves as kings of the promised land. And then the third way we see the Bible talk about authority as in inheritance. So we can see this clearly like with the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? So God gives Abraham a very clear inheritance. God just chooses Abraham and says, "This is what I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you all of these promises and all these things that I want you to be over." And those promises are really similar to what happened in the Garden of Eden, but just with more detail. Excuse me. So God promises blessings. He promises that their land is going to be cared for. He promises that Abraham is going to become a fruitful nation. And then that blessing that he has is going to expand to other nations and all people. So we see this concept of inheritance being passed down again and again through the biblical story. So Abraham passes it on to Isaac, and Isaac eventually passes it on to Moses, and Moses passes it on to Israel. And then Israel's promises are eventually passed down to the disciples, and then the disciples to the Christian church today. So, this concept of inheritance you really see a lot. So, we've talked about how God promises the Israelites to kind of look at the past, the present, and the future, and to remind ourselves of these promises and how God wants us to live our lives, both financially, but also in terms of an inheritance, just in general in our life. So Deuteronomy 8:17 through 20 is our kind of key verse today. It says, "You may say to yourself, 'My power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me.' But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gave you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms His covenant, which He swore to your ancestors as it is today. If you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and worship and bow down to them, I testify again to you today that you will surely be destroyed. Like the nations the Lord destroyed before you, so you will be destroyed for not obeying the Lord your God." So, like I said, the final concept of authority and financial strength, that the closing linchpin for this whole story is the concept of inheritance. So, God has been confirming this covenant since the very beginning, like we just talked about. And the general covenant, like this overall story that he's passing down, is basically this: we believe God, we get his authority, we act and obey the way that he tells us to, and then we get blessings. That's generally the story that God has been telling the Israelites over and over and over again. No other order works. But this order does work. This is what we see God tell the Israelites to do and how we see him bless them with the promised land. And again, every time God has talked about the promised land, every time he's talked about the future, they get more understanding about what's coming, about the promises and the inheritance. And every time he's passing it on to like a different family. But what's incredible is how many times it's passed on. So, like I said, to Abraham in Genesis 12 and 13, then to Moses in Exodus 3 and 17, then to Israel, which we see really clearly in Deuteronomy 28. He specifically tells them that you are going to be blessed no matter where you live. You're going to have children. You're going to have prosperous work and careers. You're going to have food and your needs met. Your enemies will lose. Your land will be successful. Weather will be on your side, and you will lend and not need to borrow. So, really, this concept of inheritance is not just like God's going to give them a sack of money. It's this really all encompassing thing about how their lives should look when they inherit God's blessings, right? And it's really interesting because sometimes this concept of inheritance, it's talked about in the Bible in really unique ways. So, one of the stories I noticed it in is in First Samuel chapter 2. This chapter is about Hannah, who has been barren for years and has been praying for a child. Right? So what she sorry. So what she specifically prays is that God will give her a child that she's going to dedicate to God, is what she ends up praying. And this becomes Samuel, the guy that the book is named after, right? So what's really interesting about this story is that Hannah prays for a child. But then the next chapter is a song of like thanksgiving, it's a prayer of thankfulness, but the song is not about a child. The song is literally about kings and inheritance, which is kind of a funny concept. Like, that's not actually what she was praying for. She's not even going to keep this child. She's literally going to give the child to be a priest to work in the temple. Um, but what we see in this story is that she's understanding that God is a promise keeping God and that she gets to be included in God's overall kingdom of blessings and promises. And she couldn't understand this just by getting special money and gifts from her husband. She couldn't understand it by just being patient or being strong as she waited. But an answered prayer helped her see the big picture clearly. God had a special inheritance in mind for Israel, and he was including her in it. So, can we get access to this kingdom and its benefits? What God tells us, again, is we believe God and his authority. We act and obey and get godly blessings, and no other order works. But this order does work again and again. We see it with David's story as well. So Saul later on is chosen as king, but he doesn't obey God. So his inheritance is going to be taken away. It's promised to one who follows God's heart. So then we see David get chosen as king, and God gives him help again and again to fight Goliath, to fight all these wars, to build up Jerusalem, to do these incredible things, to deal with Saul. And then he is made king. So, what we see with David's story is David believes God, he gets his authority, he acts and obeys the way that God wants him to, and then he gets godly blessings. He gets the ability to walk out these great things on earth. And the way that this is said, I've heard another pastor say it as the kingdom of God is God's people in God's place, under God's rule, enjoying God's blessings, right? So the truth is, we don't believe for a promised land. We don't believe for money. We don't believe for children. We don't believe for anything else. We believe God. Okay. Also, we don't chant and rain down blessings from heaven. This is not like some kind of thing that we have to like specifically say in order to get these blessings. We believe God. We trust His authority. We trust the things He has given us authority over. And then we act wisely and obey Him. And then blessings come because of our obedience. So, again, we see this in David's life. David has done his part and he's learned authority the ways that we've talked about, right? He's been listening to God, he's been trained under God, and God has really showed him through his battles, through his dealings with Saul. God has taught him physically how to fight for the things that God promised him. But there's one thing that David really hasn't learned, and that's this concept of inheritance. So, to be fair, if you think about David's actual family, he's not inheriting much, okay? Earlier, Samuel is the one that chooses David as king, that tells him that which of the sons is going to be chosen as king. David isn't even invited to the party, all right? The other sons matter, but David can't even doesn't even come. He's literally out working when they have this big ceremony. And then later on, you see his brothers get mad at him when he ends up fighting Goliath and all these different things. They just keep like ignoring him, glossing over him. They're really not passing down support and help to him or anything that you would get from a helpful and strong family, right? So when we get to Second Samuel 7, we see David gets to understand inheritance in a completely different way and for a very weird reason. Okay. So in Second Samuel 7, verses 1 through 7, David tells the priest that he wants to build a temple for God. And it sounds like a perfectly reasonable idea. But then God uses it as a reminder of how things actually work. And so when we read Second Samuel verses 8 through 11, God says, no, David, you're not going to build me a house. And why? Like, why wouldn't God want a temple? Why? I mean, David's got a nice fancy palace. Why not? But what God specifically says is He says, I took you from the pasture. I appointed your rules over my people. I have been with you. Now I will make your name great. Essentially, God basically puts him back in his place, right? Because if you build a house for someone else, it kind of means you're doing them a favor. And really, God doesn't need any favors. Also, God's not done with his part, right? They got the land, but God had this great thing in mind where they were going to be so well off, they didn't actually have to lend or borrow from other countries, and that they were able to teach these blessings and pass them on to other countries. And they're definitely not there yet. And also, of sins has not come with Jesus. So, God has got some steps left of his overall plan. And basically, he's reminding David that David is not in charge of this plan. God is in charge of the plan, and David is along for the ride. Again, God's people under God's rule, right? Is the important thing to remember. So basically, God includes David in the inheritance that he wasn't a part of till now. Remember, this wasn't his family's legacy that made him king. He didn't know he was supposed to inherit the promises given to Abraham and Isaac and Moses. But God adopted him into his family with all the perks that come along with the family unit. And remember, according to Deuteronomy 28, this is a lot of different things. It says you're blessed no matter where you live. You have children, prosperous work, food, needs met. Your enemies will lose, weather will be on your side, and you will lend and not borrow. Again, it's not just about a sack of money. This inheritance is a concept of God's best. It's returning to Eden and life abundantly. And the plan stays the same no matter who God is talking to throughout the Bible. And that allows this to get to a point where we don't have to endlessly fight for everything. We keep God first, and God takes care of the things that are important to Him. Okay. So, this is such an important concept for us to realize that God brings people into the family of God. 'Cause I don't know about you, but I really thought I was kind of alone in my finances for a long time. So again, I was in school for the first 25 years of my life, right? And not saving, not a dime, right? And then, I get this illness, I have all these medical bills and I'm trying to pay them off. So I'm really not doing all that well. There's medical loans, there's bills and all these things. So then I finally get a job as a doctor, and I thought I was done with the like wilderness training hard parts of my life. But then even that job went bad, right? That's the job I was talking about at the beginning. I didn't have access to a 401k. The clinic stopped providing basic things like electricity, right? They cut our paychecks and eventually the whole clinic went under. So, somewhere around this time, I made a new plan for myself. I started looking at the past of my life and looking at all my financials and looking at the way that I wanted to live my life. And just, they did not jive. They were not going to come together. I knew that God had called me to missions work, to ministry things like doing these videos, and I knew it was going to take money that I didn't have. So I just decided I was never going to retire. I was just going to work for the rest of my life. That's basically what I decided. This is my life. I'm behind on doing my jobs, so I'm gonna just keep working. And then I also decided I would save up some money, kind of like a retirement account, and I would use that for missions work. So I could go on missions trips, so I could do videos and things like that, things that I do on this channel. And the rest of the time I would just work and cover all my expenses. That was my new plan. Because as far as I was concerned, my finances all came down to me. So thankfully, though, God doesn't leave us there dealing with things all on our own. So ownership actually determines everything. And it doesn't just determine who's in charge of decisions, it determines who's in charge of the problems, right? Knowing our world, our cars, our retirement, our homes, our children are under God's rule actually takes some of the pressure off of us. It takes some of the pressure off of managing them off us and should make things a little bit easier. The best thing you can work through when truly trying to change your finances is to know where you are coming from. Obviously, our past and what our families have taught us about money do influence us, but also know where we are coming from God's perspective. Because God can rewrite whatever we used to think was our lot in life and make it into something truly different, just like we see with the story of David. And then God can kind of help us see things differently in general. So, when we read Numbers 32, the Israelites have crossed the desert. They're about to go into Israel, and two of the tribes make this very surprising announcement. The tribes of Reuben and Gad basically decide they're not going into the land of Israel. Out of the 12 tribes that were all supposed to go in and conquer the land, these two and a half, really decide that they want to stay east of the Jordan River. They want to stay in the desert they've been wandering in. And I got to be honest with you, this story kills me. Okay. I cannot get over the fact that some of the tribes of Israel did not go into the land that they were promised. They literally stopped short of their inheritance. God had promised them this land was their inheritance. And they didn't even go in and see it. They didn't even go like look at it. They just decide they're going to stay in this place that's good enough. And they haven't even experienced the greatness of what God has promised them. Remember, this is supposed to be a land of milk and honey. It's not just supposed to be all their needs met, it's supposed to be greatness. But they stop and say that they don't want more. And I wonder if it's just because they're scared. Scared, kind of like I was when I was thinking about my finances a few years ago, right? Scared that the promises are no different than wandering in the desert, scared that maybe God really doesn't have their best in mind, scared that like the possibility of more failure and more delay and more hardship just makes them freeze in place instead of actually moving forward in the way that God intended for them to do. See, because God promised greatness and He wants the same for us. He wants to bless you, not with unending war and trial and loss and pain, but with beauty and opportunity and abundance. And gosh, it's easy to scoff at the Israelites, but hard to admit how similar we are to them. Because those of us who say, well, whatever God wants me to have, are basically slaves living in front of a mansion that's been promised to them. And is that really God's best for you? So, this concept reminds me of the story of the prodigal son. The prodigal son in the New Testament, in Luke 15, the story basically says that the son decides he doesn't want to live under his father's rule anymore. So he demands that he get his inheritance, goes off and parties and lives his own life. But he parties all of the money away and soon regrets his decision. And so he considers going back to his father and trying to become like a servant or something there. And basically, when he asks for his inheritance, he basically tells his father, "Look, I want you dead. I don't want to know any of your recommendations. I don't want to know your plan for my life. I don't want to know your rules. I want to live my way." Basically, he's also talking about turning down help. He doesn't want the rules, but he also doesn't want the provision that his father has. And what if he just stayed there? What if he just stayed in this pig pen where he's like trying to work and for the rest of his life just like decides he doesn't deserve any better. He can't ask anyone for help and he just stays there living in the pigsty. Because the truth is, the story shows us that the father was actually waiting for his son to come home. He was waiting to offer forgiveness, but the son had to get into a point where he actually asked for help and took the gift that was given to him. And honestly, the story of the prodigal son is was hard for me to grasp. Like I was never the like wild child, live and do whatever you want. I was the obedient one, right? I was the rule follower. But when I think about it from a financial standpoint, it's a lot easier for me to see myself as the one who messed up. See, I knew about compounding interest from the time I was like 15, right? My mom had taught me stuff like that. But I was the one who decided to go to school for 8 years and make no money. And even the jobs I did work, I didn't put any money aside for the future. I chose what was best for me in the moment again and again. I did that after I got sick. I wanted to pay off the medical bills and just be done with them. I did that with my loans. I did that with decisions over and over again. And I was not blowing my money on extravagant parties, to be fair, but I was choosing again and again what seemed right in the moment rather than what the Bible had said, what financial advisors had said. And more than that, I knew that God was calling me to a life of missions, a life of ministry opportunities like this, of being able to do things where I had to have some money on the side to be able to afford them. So I knew that what I needed to do was create an account where I could pull money and do things like this, ventures that would cost money, missions trips that would cost money. I knew exactly what I needed to do. And all I had to do was put the money aside and save it. And I took a job that would pay me extra specifically so I could do this. And I still didn't do it. I got distracted. I used money for other things. And right when I finally said, okay, I'm ready to concentrate on the real plan, I got fired. And I just sat there thinking, could I have possibly messed this up more? Right? I wasn't in a pigsty with no money. I was sitting in an empty house with no job, going, gosh, I did not do what God had said to do. I had not stewarded well what I'd been blessed with. I was no better off than the wild son was, just doing whatever I wanted. But I can't just sit in the mess I made, refusing to get help. And I had to say, God, I'm sorry I messed this up. I can't fix this. I need you. And the one thing to remember about the prodigal son story is that God never responds when we've messed up with, well, screw you. You got what you deserved. Deal with it. That's such a beautiful thing about the prodigal son story, that God only responds with, "Oh, thank goodness you're here." The father and the son overwhelms him with gifts and with hugs and acceptance. He says, "Thank goodness you're back with me. I love you. I missed you, not because you're perfect, but because you're mine." And when my father passed away a couple of years ago, I started to understand this story in a different way. See, I did not grow up with my dad. My parents were divorced, and my dad was basically raising his girlfriend's daughter from the time I was about 10. And honestly, from a daughter perspective, I felt like I kind of missed out on everything. Like she got to live with him. He got to go to her birthday parties and her gymnastics meets and things like that. I didn't get the full relationship with my father that she did because she was there. But the thing to remember about inheritance is the law wins. So, according to the law, I am the only legal heir of my father. And so everything that he has is mine. It doesn't go to her because she spent more time with him. It doesn't go to her regardless of how it works out in my head, regardless what anyone else says. Everything he has is mine. Gosh, some random person I didn't even know reached out to me after my father died and said, I was one of his girlfriends. He promised me a red leather jacket. Can you get that for me? It's like, I don't even know who you are. But it didn't actually matter because according to the law, it was mine. And this was a really hard thing for me to grasp because I realized at some point I had stepped back in my own mind and let someone else have ownership of what was mine. I had seen the promised land, which was like my father-daughter relationship, but I let someone else claim it. I let someone else use what was rightfully mine. I had stepped back in my own fears and my own insecurities and stepped back from what I had been promised and rightfully deserved. My dad, his attention, his money, all rightfully mine. But I had disinherited myself. And maybe your story isn't quite that dramatic, but a lot of times we've done these things with our relationship with God. We've let insecurities and fears and lies get in the way of the way that we interact with Him and the confidence that we should really walk in and the authority that we have as His children. And far too often, I felt like a stepchild instead of the original daughter. But the win is when my dad passed away, it showed me what a truly godly inheritance looked like. Because again, when it came to my money, I had messed up. I knew what I should have done, but I didn't do it. But then I disinherited myself. I was like, well, I mean, God can't fix this. It's all on my back. But God stepped in and reminded me that his ministry, his business was his burden for his people, and it was on his shoulders, not just mine. So when all the bills cleared and all the broken houses were given away and all of the medical things were paid, what I was actually handed was a check from my dad that was the amount of money I should have saved for myself. It was the amount of money that I knew I needed to do ministry and something I hadn't even started doing myself and something I really hadn't even asked God for. But it was something that God gave me in spite of my mistakes, in spite of my pride, in spite of my arrogance. Instead of God saying, you get what you deserved, he handed me what I couldn't even do myself. And that's God's way of reminding us, in spite of our mistakes, in spite of our limitations, we are his children and we have an inheritance that he takes care of. And the last thing to remember from the prodigal son story is that our best laid plans are never finished. See, the son thinks that he's going to run away and find the whole life that he wants. That he's going to meet every insecurity and fear and deep need in his heart. He thinks money is going to solve all of his problems, but then he realizes that doesn't work. So he tries partying and then he realizes that doesn't work. And let me just try all these different things. And really, none of them fulfill that hole somewhere in his heart. And here's the thing, every financial book I've ever read starts with this plan that's very realistic and then just kind of never stops. You just keep buying more properties. You just keep saving more money. You just keep doing these things to get to this ultimate success. There is no end point when you look at most financial recommendations. And it seems to be this thought that, like, if I could just get away from the debt, if I could just get away from the biblical rules, if I could just get rid of all of these responsibilities, everything would be better and perfect. And that's not how the world works. That's what the world tries to tell us. But again, when we look at millionaires again and again, they show us that they're not happier, they're not fulfilled, they're still lacking, still searching for peace, love, and loneliness that can only be filled by God. It leads us to fighting battles that don't even need to be fought anymore. And so I love the story again of the Israelites. They go into the land, they take the land that God has told them to take. And when we get to the end of the book of Joshua, there's this great passage in Joshua chapter 21 that says, "And the Lord gave them rest on every side." And oh my goodness, for a perfectionist and someone who gets tired and someone who is tired of always fighting for more, that's such a beautiful thing. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, which means that, yes, sometimes we have to fight for things in our lives. And yes, sometimes we have to get in there and do the work ourselves, but that we don't end up needing to buy property for the rest of time. We don't need to work like dogs for the rest of time. Eventually, we get to this point where what God has given us is enough. And the Lord ends up being the one who fights and protects what we've got. And it's God who responds to everything that we need. So, where is your end point? What is the vision that God has given you? Do you really need millions more in order to get to that place to where you're happy and successful? Is there a place where it's going to be enough? Our finances shouldn't lead to unending fear of, Social Security like flattening out and us not being able to get there. It should lead to never ending amazement at how God continues to provide, continues to step in, continues to bless us, and continues to give us rest and promises that we don't even deserve. Finances come down to how much we trust God and do our part, but remember it's His burden, not ours to carry. I ask my dad for money, and he responds in love. I ask my father for miracles, and he responds in love. Just like the Israelites, God has chosen us. He's taken us from a place of captivity to freedom. He's given us opportunity for a whole new life, from a place of nothingness to a place of victory, from a place of zero chances to a place of infinite possibility. He doesn't just give us leftovers, but milk and honey, prosperity and abundance in a way that we hadn't even thought of before, but only when we're faithful with the small things. And don't forget, our inheritance that's coming is not just monetary provision. It encompasses all of life changes. We inherit nations, we inherit forgiveness, we inherit peace, we inherit power, we inherit authority over our lives. So, what is it that God has called you to do? Is He calling you to give away more? Is He calling you to trust Him with your imperfections and your mistakes? Is He calling you to go back to the basics and obey the simple things that He told you to do? Is He calling you to step out in an evangelistic spirit at work, to risk your paycheck for something greater? Is He calling you to take money you saved for one thing and use it for something else? Is He calling you to break addictions that would otherwise take you out from God's best for your life? What is it that God has called you to do? Can you see it clearly before you? Maybe you have glimpses of what you hope will come to pass. Maybe you only know where you are right now and are waiting patiently for the next steps to come into view. Either way, God has called you to greatness. He takes the small divots of time and energy and money and hope that we do have and explodes them into miracles of power. So don't get discouraged and don't give up. Great is your reward, not just in heaven, but for every day you choose to say, forget the past, forget the discouragement, forget the fear, forget the unknowns, forget the way it used to be. God, help me and make me into who you have called me to be. Have a good one.